Louisiana, June 1944. The heat pressed down like a physical weight on Camp Claiborne, where dust rose in clouds from every footfall and sweat soaked through uniforms before morning formation ended. In the processing yard, a captured German officer stood rigid, refusing to acknowledge the American NC taking his information. Sergeant James Washington, 3 stripes on his sleeve, clipboard in hand, patient despite the insult he understood without translation. Then Private Eddie Sullivan from Boston stepped forward, his voice cutting through the humid air with words that would force every man present to choose what they believed about dignity, about respect, about what America was supposed to mean. The summer of 1944 brought prisoners to American soil in numbers that strained the hastily expanded camp system. They came in ships across the Atlantic, captured in North Africa and Sicily and the beaches of Normandy. German soldiers who had expected death or Russian captivity and instead found themselves in places like Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, American states they'd never heard of, landscape they couldn't have imagined, administered by a military that operated according to rules they'd been taught to believe were lies. Camp Claiborne sprawled across central Louisiana, 43,000 acres of pine forest and red clay, a training facility converted partially to prisoner operations, as the war as arithmetic produced more captives than the system was designed to hold. By June 1944, it housed 3,000 German prisoners in a secure compound, separated from the main base by wire fences and guard towers, a small city of captured men waiting to learn what would become of them. The camp operated with military precision, but also with the complications that came from being located in the Deep South in 1944, where segregation was law and custom and the fundamental organizing principle of social life. The U.S. Army maintained segregated units. Black soldiers served in separate companies, ate in separate facilities, and were largely excluded from combat roles despite their capabilities. This wasn't policy from Washington so much as accommodation to regional prejudices, a compromise that satisfied no one, but seemed necessary to maintain order in a military that drew from every corner of a divided nation. Sergeant James Washington was one of approximately 4,000 black soldiers stationed at Camp Claiborne in various support roles: quartermaster, transportation, construction, maintenance. He was 28 years old, from Chicago, educated through 2 years of college before the draft claimed him in 1942. He had hoped for combat assignment, had volunteered repeatedly, and had been repeatedly told his talents were needed elsewhere. The elsewhere was administration, processing, the endless paperwork that military operations generated. By 1944, Washington had accepted his role, if not embraced it. He ran the prisoner intake section with quiet competence, overseeing the documentation and initial processing of captured Germans as they entered the camp system. He spoke some German from childhood neighbors in Chicago, enough to handle basic communication. He maintained records with precision that earned respect from officers who valued efficiency over prejudice. He existed in the narrow space that black NCOs occupied in the segregated military, respected for competence, excluded from equality, tolerated as necessary, never quite accepted as belonging. Private Eddie Sullivan was 19 years old, from South Boston, and had been in the Army for 8 months. He had grown up in an Irish Catholic neighborhood where prejudice was casual, and assumptions about racial hierarchy were absorbed without examination or question. He had never thought much about black Americans. They existed in separate neighborhoods, separate schools, separate worlds that rarely intersected with his own. The Army had thrust them together in ways civilian life never did, and Sullivan was discovering that assumptions didn't survive contact with reality. He had been assigned to Washington S section after showing aptitude for administrative work and languages. He spoke passable French from high school and was learning German through immersion with prisoners. He worked for Washington daily, took orders from him, observed how he operated, and was slowly, almost unwillingly, having his understanding of the world revised by the evidence of his own experience. Washington was smarter than Sullivan, more organized, better with languages, more patient under stress. These weren't opinions. They were observable facts that Sullivan witnessed every day. And they contradicted everything he'd been taught about racial capability, about natural hierarchies, about who was suited for what kinds of work. The contradiction created cognitive dissonance that Sullivan couldn't quite resolve, so mostly he just focused on the work and tried not to think too hard about what it meant. June 15, 1944. Morning arrived hot and humid, temperature already climbing toward 90 by 8 a.m., air thick enough to feel like breathing through wet cloth. A transport had arrived overnight from the East Coast, 53 German prisoners, mostly captured in the Normandy fighting, shipped across the Atlantic, and then by rail to Louisiana for long-term internment. They filed off the trucks in the processing yard, guarded by MPs with rifles, and that mix of alertness and boredom that characterized soldiers doing routine security work. The prisoners looked tired, dirty, disoriented men who had been fighting in France 2 weeks earlier and were now standing in Louisiana heat, trying to understand how their lives had arrived at this point. Standard procedure called for initial documentation before assignment to barracks. Name, rank, serial number, date and location of capture, medical assessment, personal effects inventory. Washington oversaw the process from behind a wooden table set up in partial shade, clipboard ready, forms arranged in neat stacks, translator standing by for when his German wasn't sufficient. The first 20 prisoners processed smoothly. They were mostly enlisted men, young soldiers who had survived combat and capture and seemed more relieved than resistant, answering questions with mechanical compliance. Yes, their names were such and such. Yes, they'd been captured on June 8th near Corentin. No, they had no medical complaints requiring immediate attention. The bureaucratic machinery turned, papers were stamped, and the men were sent to holding pens to await barracks assignment. Then came the officers. German military culture maintained strict hierarchy even in captivity. The officers had been kept separate during transport, would be housed separately at camp, and expected treatment according to their rank under Geneva Convention provisions. 3 of them had arrived with this transport, 2 lieutenants and 1 captain, men who had commanded units in combat and carried themselves with the bearing of people accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. The captain was named Dieter Hoffmann, 34 years old, from a military family in Prussia, career officer who had fought in Poland, France, and Russia before the Normandy assignment that had ended with capture. He was tall, thin, weathered by years of combat, and carried himself with the rigid formality that characterized professional German officers. He also carried the ideological certainty that years of regime propaganda had instilled beliefs about racial hierarchy, about natural superiority, about the proper ordering of human beings into categories of greater and lesser worth. Hoffmann approached Washington's processing table with visible distaste. He registered Washington's rank insignia, registered his skin color, and his expression shifted from neutral compliance to something else, contempt, mixed with disbelief, the look of someone confronting something that violated their understanding of how the world was supposed to work. Washington had seen that look before, not just from German prisoners, but from white American soldiers, from Southern officers, from civilians in towns near bases. He recognized it and had developed strategies for handling it: professionalism, politeness, refusal to acknowledge the insult, focus on the task at hand, get through the interaction, complete the work, move on to the next thing. Dignity through competence, respect through giving no cause for legitimate complaint. He looked up from his clipboard as Hoffmann stopped in front of the table. Name and rank, Washington said in clear English, then repeated in German for clarity. Hoffmann stared at him without responding. The silence stretched, becoming pointed, becoming a statement. The other prisoners in line watched. The American guards watched. Sullivan, standing to Washington's left with his own clipboard, watched. Washington tried again. I need your name and rank for processing. Geneva Convention requires proper documentation. Still no response. Hoffman looked past Washington as if he weren't there, as if the table was empty, as if he was waiting for someone who mattered to address him. Lieutenant Morrison, the white officer supervising the processing area, noticed the stalled interaction and walked over. Problem here? Washington kept his voice neutral. Prisoner won't respond to questions, sir. Morrison addressed Hoffman directly. Captain, you're required to provide information for processing. Refusing cooperation could result in punishment under camp regulations. Hoffman spoke for the first time, in heavily accented but clear English. I will not speak to him. I am German officer. I do not take orders from inferiors. The word hung in the humid air like smoke. Inferiors, not soldiers. Not Americans, inferiors. The categorization stripped away nationality and rank and military status, reducing Washington to something less than human, something unworthy of basic acknowledgement. Morrison's face reddened. He was from Maryland, had complicated feelings about race that he'd never examined too closely, but he understood military authority and wouldn't tolerate a prisoner, an enemy prisoner, refusing to cooperate with a U.S. Army NCO. UL answer Sergeant Washington as questions, or UL go to the isolation block until you decide to cooperate. Your choice. Hoffman smiled thinly. You Americans are confused about many things. In proper armies, men know their place. This one, double quotes, he gestured dismissively toward Washington, should not wear that uniform, should not give orders to white soldiers, should not pretend to be what he is not. The processing yard had gone quiet. 50 German prisoners watched. 20 American guards watched. Everyone understood that something larger than a single interaction was happening here, some confrontation about values and hierarchy, and what the war was actually about beneath the tactics and strategies. Washington felt the familiar weight settle onto his shoulders, the burden of representing, of being made to stand for every black American, of having his individual dignity conflated with political statements about an entire race. He had handled hundreds of prisoner intakes. He had been insulted before, directly and indirectly, by word and gesture and calculated silence. His strategy was always the same: professionalism, dignity, refusal to engage on the level of insult. Do the job, maintain composure, give them no ammunition. But before he could respond, before Morrison could escalate to punishment, Eddie Sullivan stepped forward. Sullivan had been standing to the side, watching this interaction with growing discomfort that he didn't quite understand. He was 19 years old, from South Boston, raised with prejudices he'd never questioned. But for the past 5 months he'd worked for Washington, had watched him operate, had seen his competence and fairness in the way he handled stress that would have broken lesser men. And something about watching this German officer, this captured enemy who had lost the war insult, the man Sullivan answered to daily, had flipped a switch somewhere deep in his understanding of the world. He moved to stand beside Washington, positioning himself deliberately between the sergeant and Hoffman. His voice came out steady, despite the anger that made his hands shake. You don't get to do that. Hoffman looked at him with surprise. A white American private defending a black NCO against a German officer. It didn't fit his categories, didn't match his understanding of how racial hierarchy operated. Do what? Hoffman asked with affected confusion. You don't get to insult Sergeant Washington. You don't get to refuse orders from him. You're a prisoner. He's American Army. That means you do what he says, answer his questions, and show respect to the uniform, even if you can't manage to show respect to the man. The words came out with the clipped intensity of someone who had made a decision and was committed despite not fully understanding why. Sullivan wasn't thinking about politics or civil rights or the larger implications of segregation. He was thinking about the specific. Washington, who he worked for daily, who had taught him proper documentation procedures, who had covered for him when he made mistakes, who was a better soldier than Sullivan would probably ever be. Morrison looked uncertain, aware that this had escalated beyond his comfort zone. Private Sullivan. But Sullivan wasn't finished. He turned to the assembled prisoners, raising his voice so all could hear, switching to his halting German for emphasis. You all need to understand something. In America, we're fighting for freedom. Real freedom. For everyone. We don't always get it right. He glanced at Washington, acknowledging the contradiction. But we're trying. And this sergeant here? He's more American than any of you will ever be. He's better at his job than most of the white soldiers I know. He's smarter, more organized, more patient. And you, he pointed at Hoffman, you lost. You lost the war. You lost because your ideas about who matters and who doesn't are wrong. And standing here in the Louisiana heat, a prisoner being processed by a black sergeant you think is inferior to you, maybe you ought to consider that everything you were taught about racial superiority was just another lie your leadership told you before they sent you out to lose. Silence held in the yard. A temperature felt 10 degrees hotter suddenly, sweat running down faces, uniforms soaked through, everyone frozen in place by the unexpected confrontation. Washington stared at Sullivan with an expression combining surprised gratitude and something more complicated, the awareness that this moment would cost Sullivan something that standing up for a black NCO in front of other white soldiers in Louisiana in 1944 was not without consequences, that Sullivan had just marked himself as different from others in ways that would follow him. Hoffman's face had gone rigid with anger and something else, maybe the beginning of doubt, maybe just rage at having his certainties challenged by a teenager from Boston. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, calculation visible in his eyes as he weighed options. Morrison made the decision. Captain Hoffman, you're going to isolation until you're ready to cooperate with proper procedures. Guards, take him. He turned to the other German officers in line. Anyone else want to refuse cooperation with American military personnel, regardless of their race? Now's your time to speak up. The two lieutenants shook their heads quickly. They had seen which way this was going and wanted no part of it. They would answer questions, fill out forms, follow procedures, maintain Geneva Convention compliance without importing their prejudices into the interaction. Hoffman was led away by two MPs, still rigid, still maintaining the posture of superiority, even as he walked toward isolation. The processing resumed. The remaining prisoners moved through Washington's table with mechanical efficiency, answering questions, providing information, careful to show no disrespect that might land them in isolation with Hoffman. When the last prisoner had been processed and sent to holding, Morrison dismissed the detail. Guards dispersed. Prisoners were led to their barracks assignments. The yard emptied until only Morrison, Washington, and Sullivan remained. Morrison addressed Sullivan first. That was insubordinate, Private. Yes, sir. You spoke out of turn, challenged a prisoner without authorization, made political statements that exceeded your authority. Yes, sir. Morrison studied him for a long moment. Also brave. Also right. Also exactly what American soldiers should do when they see something wrong. Don't do it again without asking permission first. But ... double quotes. He paused, something like approval in his eyes. Good work. He left, returning to his office, leaving Washington and Sullivan standing in the Louisiana heat, dust settling around them, the weight of what had happened still hanging in the air. Washington spoke first. You didn't have to do that. Yeah, Sullivan said. I did. It'll cost you. Other soldiers will hear about it. White soldiers. Some of them won't like that you defended me. Let them not like it. Sullivan wiped sweat from his face, his hand still trembling slightly from adrenaline. Sergeant, I grew up with ideas about race that I never questioned. They were just there, like the air. Everyone around me believed them, so I believed them too. But working for you these past months, I've seen those ideas were wrong. You're better at this job than I'll probably ever be. You're smarter, more organized, more patient. And watching that German officer call you inferior, watching him refuse to acknowledge you because of your skin color, it made me understand something. What's that? That the regime we're fighting, all that propaganda about racial superiority, about some people being naturally better than others, we've got our own version of that here. It's not identical, but it's the same poison. And if I'm going to fight against it over there, I can't stay silent about it here. Washington was quiet for a moment, processing this statement from a 19-year-old kid from South Boston who was working through ideas that most people spent lifetimes avoiding. That's more evolved thinking than most people twice your age manage. I don't know about evolved. I just know what I see. And what I see is that you're a better soldier than that German captain will ever be, and a better man than most people. I know, and if someone needs to say that out loud, might as well be me. They stood in the heat, this odd pair brought together by war and administrative assignment, slowly realizing they had become something like friends, despite all the social barriers designed to prevent exactly that kind of relationship. Thank you, Washington said finally, for what you did, for what you said. It mattered. Sullivan nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude, still processing his own motivations. Anytime, Sergeant. Anytime. The incident rippled through Camp Claiborne over the following days. Among German prisoners, word spread about the black American sergeant and the white private who had defended him against an officer insult. Some prisoners dismissed it as American confusion, evidence of the disorder they'd been taught characterized democratic societies. Others saw it differently, saw it as proof that the propaganda they'd been fed was wrong, that American ideals about equality might be more than just words that the country they'd been fighting against actually believed in something beyond power and conquest. Among American soldiers, reactions were mixed. Some white soldiers thought Sullivan was a fool, that defending a black NCO over a white German officer was racial betrayal, that it upset natural hierarchies better left undisturbed. Others, particularly those who had worked with black soldiers and seen their competence firsthand, quietly approved, recognizing that Sullivan had stood up for a principle that mattered even when staying silent would have been easier. Among black soldiers, the story became legend. Washington hadn't wanted the attention, would have preferred to handle the situation through normal channels without confrontation. But the black enlisted men at Claiborne heard about a white private defending a black sergeant and saw it as evidence that progress was possible, that some white Americans could see past skin color to recognize competence and character. Captain Hoffman spent 3 days in isolation before requesting to speak with camp administration. He met with the camp commandant, Colonel James Patterson, a career officer from Pennsylvania who had spent enough time managing diverse units to have complicated views on race that didn't fit neatly into either progressive or reactionary categories. "You wanted to see me, Captain?" Patterson asked in German, using the language to make communication easier and to show some respect for Hoffman's rank despite his prisoner status. Hoffman sat stiffly in the office chair, still maintaining military bearing. "I want to understand American military structure. I am confused about what I witnessed." "What specifically confuses you?" "The black sergeant. He outranks white soldiers. White soldiers take orders from him. This seems contrary to proper military organization." Patterson leaned back in his chair, considering how to explain complexities that he himself didn't fully endorse, but had learned to work within. "America has complicated relationship with race. We maintain segregated units, which satisfies no one but seems necessary to maintain order. But within those constraints, black soldiers can earn rank, command authority, demonstrate competence. Sergeant Washington is very good at his job. He's earned his position through merit. But that white private, he defended the black sergeant against me, a German officer. This is unnatural." "Unnatural?" Patterson's tone sharpened. "Captain, You re-sitting in my office because you refused to cooperate with proper military procedures based on the race of the NCO processing you. Private Sullivan defended the authority of a superior NCO who was being insulted by a prisoner. That's not unnatural. That's exactly what military discipline requires. You show respect to rank, regardless of who wears it. Hoffman was silent for a moment, working through concepts that contradicted his lifelong training. In proper military structures, in your military structure, Patterson interrupted, you lost. You lost because you excluded massive portions of your population from full participation based on arbitrary categories. You lost because you promoted incompetence who had correct ideology over competence who could actually win battles. You lost because you built your entire system on lies about superiority that reality kept contradicting. So maybe, Captain, you should consider that American military structures, complicated and imperfect as they are, work better than yours did. The words landed hard, undeniable in their truth. Germany had lost. American forces were processing thousands of prisoners daily, occupying territory, winning the war through better strategy, better logistics, better use of all available human resources despite artificial constraints. What happens now? Hoffman asked quietly. Now you cooperate with prisoner processing, including answering Sergeant Washington's questions with proper military courtesy. You follow camp regulations. You serve out your time as prisoner of war according to Geneva Convention standards. And maybe, if you're smart, you use this time to reconsider some of the ideas that led to you sitting in this office as a defeated enemy, rather than standing in Berlin as a victor. Hoffman was returned to the general prisoner population with instructions that his behavior would determine whether he received officer privileges or was treated like any other prisoner. Word of his conversation with Patterson spread through the prisoner compound, adding another layer to the ongoing discussion about American values, about race, about what it meant that their captors maintained contradictions they were openly working to resolve. Sullivan's relationship with other white soldiers became complicated. Some ostracized him quietly, no dramatic confrontations, just the slow exclusion that comes from being marked as different. Others approached him privately to say they agreed with what he'd done, that they'd worked with black soldiers, and found them capable, that the segregation system seemed increasingly absurd the more you actually engaged with it. His relationship with Washington deepened. They worked together daily, and the barrier that rank and race had created had been permanently lowered by the incident. They talked more freely, Washington sharing experiences of discrimination Sullivan had never considered. Sullivan describing the prejudices he'd been raised with and was now trying to unlearn. It was education neither had expected, friendship that regulations discouraged, but human decency demanded. 2 months later, in August 1944, orders came for Sullivan. He was being transferred to language school, trained as German interpreter for frontline interrogation units. The transfer meant leaving Camp Claiborne, leaving the administrative work, leaving Washington. They met for the last time in Washington's office, the small room where months of paperwork and processing had occurred, where Sullivan had learned both German and more important lessons about humanity. "You'll do good work over there," Washington said, referring to the European theater Sullivan would eventually deploy to. "Your German's solid now, and you understand how to read people. Learned that from watching you," Sullivan said. "How you handle prisoners, how you stay calm when they're trying to get under your skin, how you maintain dignity no matter what. That's worth more than language training." Washington pulled something from his desk drawer, a small leather notebook, worn from use. "I want you to have this. It's empty now, but I've kept journals like it since I joined up. Write down what you see over there, the good and bad, the contradictions. We're fighting for freedom while maintaining segregation at home. That's a contradiction that needs resolving, and the people who can see both sides clearly are the ones who'll help resolve it." Sullivan accepted the notebook with hands that understood the gift's weight. I don't know if I'm smart enough for that kind of thinking. You're 19 and already questioning prejudices most people never question their entire lives. That's smart enough. Washington extended his hand, and Sullivan shook it. This formal gesture that crossed the boundaries of race and rank and the segregated society they both inhabited. Take care of yourself, Sergeant. You too, Private. And Sullivan. What you did that day with Hoffman defending me, when you didn't have to. I'll remember that. More importantly, every black soldier who heard about it will remember. You showed that principles matter more than prejudice. That's worth remembering. They parted then, Washington remaining at camp, Claiborne to continue his administrative work, Sullivan heading to language school, and eventually to Europe, where he would use his German to interrogate prisoners and slowly realize that the lessons about humanity he'd learned from Washington mattered more than any technical skill. The war continued. More prisoners arrived at Claiborne. More processing occurred. Washington handled it all with the same quiet competence, and the German prisoners learned to show proper respect, regardless of their private prejudices, understanding that American authority came in many colors, and refusing to acknowledge that would only make their captivity harder. After the war, Sullivan returned to Boston. He attended college on the GI Bill, studied languages and history, became a teacher in Boston public schools. When the civil rights movement began gaining momentum in the 1950s, he was among the white Bostonians who supported integration, who spoke at community meetings, who used his veteran status to argue that Americans who had fought together against fascism abroad should maintain segregation at home. He told the story often about Camp Claiborne, about Sergeant Washington, about Captain Hoffman, about the moment when a 19-year-old kid from South Boston realized that everything he'd been taught about racial hierarchy was wrong, and that defending a good man mattered more than maintaining prejudice. Washington remained in the Army after the war, eventually earning his commission through officer candidate school when the military began slowly, inadequately integrating. He retired as a major in 1962, having served 20 years in an institution that was deeply flawed but slowly changing, imperfect but improving. He had seen progress measured in small steps, integrated units, black officers commanding white soldiers, the gradual erosion of formal segregation, even as informal barriers remained. In 1968, Sullivan traveled to Chicago for a reunion of Camp Claiborne personnel. He found Washington living in a South Side neighborhood, working as a community organizer, still fighting the good fight for civil rights in civilian life. They spent an evening together, two men in their 40s now, remembering Louisiana heat and prisoner processing, and the moment when principles had mattered more than prejudice. "Do you think it made a difference?" Sullivan asked. "That day when I defended you against Hoffman?" Washington considered the question seriously. Yes, not in any dramatic way. It didn't end segregation or change military policy. But it showed that white Americans could choose to see black Americans as equals, as fellow soldiers, as people deserving of respect. Every time someone makes that choice, it weakens the system that says we can't be equal. Every time a white private defends a black sergeant, it proves the propaganda wrong. So yes, it mattered. Maybe more than you know. They talked late into the night, these unlikely friends brought together by war, an administrative assignment, and one moment of moral clarity in a Louisiana processing yard. They talked about progress and setbacks, about how far America had come and how far it still needed to go, about the ongoing work of living up to ideals that had always been proclaimed but not always practiced. Years later, historians documenting the slow integration of the U.S. military would find records of the incident at Camp Claiborne. Morrison's report, Patterson's notes, witness statements. It would become a small footnote in the larger story of how American military gradually, incompletely, inadequately worked toward the equality its founding documents promised, but its practices denied. But for the men who were there, for Washington and Sullivan, and the soldiers who witnessed it, the incident was more than footnote. It was proof that individuals could choose better than their society, that moral clarity could emerge even in teenagers from prejudiced backgrounds, that defending someone else's dignity might cost you something, but was worth the price. Camp Claiborne eventually closed, its buildings demolished or repurposed, its history reduced to documents and memories. But what happened there in June 1944 remained in the stories veterans told, in the example they provided, in the slow accumulation of moments when people chose justice over prejudice, when they recognized that equality wasn't just abstract principle, but concrete practice, when they understood that defending someone else's humanity was defending their own. Sometimes history turns on great battles and grand strategies. Sometimes it turns on a private from Boston telling a German officer that his racial theories were wrong, that the sergeant he'd insulted was a better man, that American ideals about equality mattered even when American practice fell short. It was just one moment, one confrontation, one decision by a 19-year-old to stand up for his sergeant against an enemy's insult. But small moments matter. Individual choices accumulate. And sometimes, in the heat and dust of a Louisiana processing yard, someone decides that principles matter more than prejudice, that competence deserves respect, regardless of skin color, that being American means defending the dignity of all Americans, even when your society makes that difficult. Eddie Sullivan made that choice. James Washington lived the principle that deserved defending. And for one moment in June 1944, they showed that America's ideals could be more than rhetoric, could be lived choices, could be real even when everything else about the system suggested they were just words.